In this video, we're going to take a look at the difference between talking about production possibilities in terms of inputs compared to production possibilities in terms of outputs. Ultimately, they're measuring the same thing, but oftentimes we can get the terms of what we're talking about in terms of inputs, and we just have to kind of go through another step to look at it in terms of outputs. So, for example, we're going to use we'll use the United States and Canada as just our example. So we'll say we have the U.S. and we have Canada, and these two countries can produce two goods. These two goods we'll call cars, and we'll call just grain, right? Something like that. So if we look at it in terms of inputs, we could say, okay, it takes this many workers to produce, let's say, 1 unit of this good. So let's say cars. How many workers does it take to produce a car? So for the United States, let's say that it takes 10 workers to produce a car. And for Canada, it takes 20 workers to produce a car. So in those sorts of terms, when we talk about absolute advantage, which country has the absolute advantage in car production? Well, it's the one that takes fewer workers to produce the good. All right, so if we look at it like this, and we say, the U.S. cars, Canada cars, and we can produce grain, and let's say that each country has 100 workers, and so if they have 100 workers, the U.S. could produce 10 cars, right? The U.S. could produce 10 cars if it had 100 workers, because it takes 10 workers to produce a car. Whereas Canada, on the other hand, could only produce 5 cars, right, with 100 workers, because it takes 20 workers to produce 1 car. And then we're talking about the same thing, right? The U.S. has an absolute advantage because they can produce twice as many cars as Canada can, or it takes half as many workers, but we're talking about the same thing. And so if we look at absolute advantage in terms of grain, let's say for grain, it takes the U.S. 5 workers to produce grain, and it takes Canada, let's say it takes them 5 as well. All right. So for grain, if they have 100 workers, and it takes 5 workers to produce that, they can produce 20 and 20. All right, so absolute advantage in terms of, this is cars, in terms of grain is none. It just happens that they're the same. All right, but that doesn't matter. They should still be able to trade. So we can look at comparative advantage next. And we go about this in a very, very similar process. So the first thing that we want to do is we kind of want to convert these numbers into one good compared to how much of the other good, all right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to put these in sort of like terms. And what you're going to notice is we're going to end up with the charts looking exactly the same. So we're going to kind of convert these inputs into outputs in terms of opportunity costs, and then it'll be showing us the same thing. So we're going to go with the process that we already know, which is an output sort of process. So in outputs, remember output, other number goes over. And so in order to calculate this, it would be 1 car is the equivalent of 2 grain, right? So for every 1 car I made, I could have made 2 units of grain, right? Because I ended up getting 20 instead of 10, so I could have made 2 units. And then it's the inverse over here. 1 grain is the equivalent of half of a car. And then for this one, 1 car is the equivalent of 4 grain, and 1 grain is the equivalent of 1/4 of a car. And now we have all of our terms, and so we're able to see that the U.S. has the comparative advantage in cars, and Canada, because of the 1/4 opportunity cost for grain production compared to 1/2 for the U.S., has the comparative advantage in the production of grain. So we know that the U.S., according to all of this, the U.S. is going to produce cars and Canada is going to produce grain. Now, does the inputs tell us the same thing? So let's look. Well, for inputs, our acronym for inputs is inputs, other number goes under, or you could think about it like this. If it takes 10 workers to produce a car, how much grain could those workers have produced? You have 10 workers. They could have made grain. How much grain could they have made? So one car is the equivalent of how much could those 10 workers have made in grain? Well, they could have made, since it only takes 5 workers, they could have made 2 grain. In other words, 10, other number goes under 5, 10 over 5. All right, and then we do the inverse over here, which is 1 grain is equivalent of 1/2 of a car, which obviously you're seeing the same numbers as we do have on the right-hand side. And then down here, 1 car, right? It took 20 workers to make that 1 car. How much grain could those 20 workers have made? They could have made 4 grain, or 1 grain is equivalent of 1/4 of a car. And now these numbers that we have right here, these are all in terms of outputs. So IOU is when you have an input question and we convert it to output numbers to show us, again, who's got an absolute or comparative advantage, or I should just say comparative advantage in these two goods. All right, so one more time. The US, 2 is better than a 4, and Canada, 1/4 is better than 1/2. So just to review one more time, what should they trade for, right? What's an okay trade, right? So one of the easiest ways to do it is you look for the number in between the two opportunity costs. So we know that the US is going to produce cars, so the US has cars. So let's say they're willing to give up 1 car, right? How much grain could they get if they did it themselves, all right? So this is the US giving a car. If they did it themselves, so if they got it from the US, which is themselves, they could make 2 grain. So they want something better than 2 grain, right? So Canada has grain, and they're willing to give the US some grain, but they want to give them less than the 4 grain that it cost themselves to get 1 car. So they're going to get a car, and they want to give up less than 4, right, which is this number right here. That's how much it costs them to make a car. But they have to do better than 2, which is what it would cost the US to do it themselves. So obviously they come back with 3. The US says yes to 3, and they're good. 1 car to 3 grain, and both are better off. The US gains an extra 1 compared to what it would have done themselves, and Canada gives up 1 less than it would have cost them to do it themselves, right? If you put this in terms of 1 grain, it would be the equivalent of 1/3 of a car, right? Because if you make that trade 3 times, right, to get, we trade 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, you're going to end up with 1 whole car is equal to 3 grain, which is what we have right here. Same thing. All right, there you go. This is an input question looking at terms of trade.